Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is Ukraine War News Update, second part thereof for the 27th of February 2024. Apologies for the first video, the delay getting it out. YouTube had an outage, I think across the world, where no one could upload videos, and that was causing quite a bit of consternation, so apologies for that. Now, this second video will be quite a chunky video because I have quite a lot to talk about. I am thinking things are moving towards a more formally obvious conflict between warring factions of the world. And I think it's kind of, we're going through a period of picking sides. I just hope American lawmakers are going to pick the right side overall. Because it seems pretty obvious now that Europe is coalescing around this idea that the conflict in Ukraine really is serious. And if we don't expedite our assistance to Ukraine, we will pay a much larger cost, both in terms of human cost and financial cost going forward. I'm going to dip into a number of different sources to talk about this. But first, I'm going to go to Emmanuel Macron's, the French president's convening of an emergency meeting last night in Paris with a whole number of dignitaries from various places, European nations particularly, that I think signifies a couple of things. First of all, Emmanuel Macron's come to the party and he's dressed up to the nines. What I mean by that is that we have heard previously that he's had decent rhetoric. But the French have been a little bit reserved about admitting what they're doing in terms of military aid and arguably not committing enough military aid to Ukraine. You can have that argument about, well, okay, some of it was private and we don't hear about it. But at the beginning of the war, if you remember, so politically speaking, Emmanuel Macron, I think, wants to be at the center of attention. When you're doing politics in Europe, there's also a sense of relaying to your own population that you are at the center of it, that you're important, that you're doing a good job on behalf of your nation in Europe. Okay, so at the beginning of the war, Emmanuel Macron was positioning himself as the deal maker, as a peacemaker between Putin and Zelensky. And it's like, right, I'm going to be on the blower, I'm going to be on the phone to Putin, I'm going to keep phoning him, and it's going to be me, Emmanuel Macron, that gets this peace deal done. And thank you very much. I'm going to come out of this looking good. And I think that's kind of what some leaders are thinking about all the time, which is not only trying to do the right thing, but also trying to make myself look good to the people whom I need to look good to, my domestic audience or my peers, and trying to vie, say, inside Europe in this bloc, political and trade bloc. I'm vying to put France at the top if I'm Macron, or Germany at the top if I'm Scholz, and so on and so forth. And you've got a number of people who are coming to the fore. And I think it's a really interesting time in European politics because there are a number, Frederiksen from Denmark, Kaja Kallas from Estonia. I think, these people are really placing themselves in the international circuit and doing a good job for their own PR, whilst also doing the right things, right? And saying the right things. Emmanuel Macron has moved from, because he realized fairly soon, although not as early as some might have hoped, that actually there was no doing a peace deal with Putin. And I think the general realization now with everyone is that Putin isn't going to do a negotiation. He's not going to do a peace deal. And to Macron's credit, because I think it's really easy to criticize Macron, and a lot of people do, and a lot of French people do, right? He's not the most popular leader. But right now, we need, Ukraine needs big name politicians in particularly Europe, given the impasse in Congress in the US, to stand up and coalesce people around them to say, I am going to fight for Ukraine. I am going to spearhead this movement. Now, there are people calling for someone like Boris Johnson to be that person, or for David Cameron to be that person, because Britain have been staunch supporters of Ukraine right at the beginning. But that doesn't seem to have happened, and we are now slightly outside of the EU, obviously, Brexit and all that. But actually, in terms of being prominent European voices, Britain is naturally going to find that more difficult. We have the advantage of language, and we have the advantage of a history where we are kind of looked up to. It's quite interesting speaking to Ukrainians recently, saying that, we always, the person gave me a lift back from Chelm in Poland to Warsaw, was telling me, as a Ukrainian, she's saying, we always look up to the UK. We always pay attention to what their views are. I thought this was really interesting because I live in a bubble of being in the UK, but actually in Europe and in the wider world, there's a lot of cynicism towards the UK, but actually we've always had an opinion that has mattered to other people. And the problem with Brexit, and that, yes, I'm a Remainer and I wanted us to remain in Europe, but actually I wanted us to remain in Europe largely because of that, because of the influence we had within a larger network of people that we are now no longer going to have to that degree. Anyway, I don't want to sidetrack this. So the point is that Macron is, I think, trying to be that person, and you can be cynical about that. I am going to celebrate that because Ukraine needs that. So whatever you think about Macron, like whether you like him as a politician, whether you don't like him as a politician, whether this or that about his domestic policies, right now, what he did yesterday is, I think, super important and super good for Ukraine. Right, so let's go and look a little bit. I'm quite invigorated today, and I'm quite worried as well. This is an inflection point, I think, in the history of the world. Like, it's developing right now, and I hopefully I'm not over-egging this and interpreting this in a way that it's not. But I think when you have an emergency meeting put on by Macron, and he says the things he said, and the people there thinking and saying the things they're saying, and again, I'm going to dip into some other sources, I think this is serious now, much more than it was a year ago. So today in Paris, Macron is gathering about 20 European leaders for an urgent meeting. It's noted that the purpose of the meeting is a public message to Putin, which should counter the Kremlin's narrative that Russia will definitely win the war in Ukraine, which has been going on for the third year. In particular, they will discuss the purchase of hundreds of thousands of ammunition, pieces of ammunition from third countries, which was previously blocked by France. Right, we'll come to that in a second. So Macron announced new measures to provide more weapons to Ukraine during a summit organised in Paris with 27 other countries. He announced, so bear in mind that most of this reporting is Macron's done this, he has announced this. Although this will be European nations coming together, this is a case of doing the right thing for Ukraine, but actually he will be thinking about his own position in his domestic politics and in European politics, and if he can cement his position going forward, either whether he's in power or not. There's a lot to be said, and this is the case for most people in the world. There will be two levels of politicking going on. The right moral and political thing to do, and how am I looking in this? And how does this play for me personally and politically? Anyway, he announced the creation of the coalition for deep strikes in order to provide Ukraine with medium and long range missiles and bombs. Right. Please go back to what I've been saying for the last, I don't know how long now, but I've said this is a really easy war to win. You just provide Ukraine with medium and long range missiles and bombs. That's basically what I've been saying. It's like, you win this by not committing troops and by hammering the Russians by using distant standoff munitions. More missiles and rockets that you can poke a hairy stick at, and artillery ammunition and mortar ammunition, and go 3, 4, 5, 6 months of doing that consistently, and then the Russians are reduced to a shadow of what they were, and then you move forward, and in that time you regather, reconstitute, retrain your troops. That may take 6 months, it may take a year, but that's what you do, in my opinion. And that Macron is broadly saying this, right, we need a coalition for deep strikes. This is music to my ears. Like, this is why I am quite invigorated. Like, I want to use the right word. So anyway, quote, to contradict the impression that things are falling apart. So this is not only about tangible equipment to Ukraine, but this is about controlling the narrative as well. And this is, and we're going to talk about this in a bit. This is about fighting the war on the material battlefield front, fighting the war on the cyber front, which then leads into fighting the war, as I always say, on the information front, in our heads, right? And we're going to come to, of all people, Hillary Clinton absolutely freaking nails it later. I'm going to come to that. And if you don't like Hillary Clinton, you can't argue with what she says. If you're pro-Ukrainian. So anyway, we'll come to that. So anyway, to reaffirm that we are not tired and that we are determined to thwart Russian aggression. Okay. So that included that meeting, Scandinavian, Baltic countries, leaders of these countries, Chancellor of Germany, Prime Minister of the Netherlands, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Great Britain. So I presume that's David Cameron there. So we have all the big hitters in Europe and David Cameron, who is getting some plaudits at the moment. I'm not a fan of Cameron. I'm not a conservative. He effectively facilitated us getting out of Europe, even though he's a Remainer. But I was reading an article the other day, I think it might have been in The Guardian, saying, do you know what, he's doing a good job. And actually, he's been really bloody busy. And he's out and about, and some good stuff is coming from him. And I feel that, and that's good. Credit where credit is due. So Kaja Kallas, who I think is going to be a big name for EU positions, NATO positions, all of this kind of stuff. She's putting her name in the mix here. So again, this is all about doing your politics and also having your own personal political identity. Making decisions that you would assume are going to benefit both here. So anyway, she's there at the invitation of Macron, and she says to discuss how to help Ukraine win this war. So now you are hearing, I think Macron said this as well, Kaja Kallas has said this, is about winning the war, not being in for as long as it takes. No, frick that. And everyone's been very clear about how we need to change the language now. It's about winning the war. Weapons promised must reach a front. Our long-term support must continue. Estonia's military aid to Ukraine will be at 0.25% of our GDP over the next 4 years. Estonia brought out a massive report where they were imploring allies to support Ukraine at 0.25% of GDP. And that is really doable. And if all the allies, so say all the NATO countries did that, then Ukraine would be replete with all sorts of stuff, all sorts of equipment, and they wouldn't have a problem defeating Russia in the war. And actually, that's really doable. Their big report, Dom Nichols from Ukraine, the latest podcast from Daily Telegraph, talks about this all the time. That report brought out by them was a really good one. And they are saying, and we're going to do that for 4 years. 4 years, 0.25% of our GDP. We're going to come on to talk about the massive news about Poland, which I presume is true. And that's another indicator that things are getting really freaking serious. Okay, moving on. Macron announced a creation of a coalition to provide Ukraine with long-range weapons. The Netherlands has already agreed to allocate 100 million euros for the purchase of artillery shells outside the EU. So one of the big things that came out of this is that Macron has now agreed that it's so important that Ukraine gets ammunition that they are not going to block EU funds buying ammunition from outside the EU. This is huge, right? I think, for Macron to say, right, sod this, we need to just get stuff to Ukraine, is A, to admit how desperate it is for Ukraine with regard to ammunition and weaponry. B, to admit that the US not doing anything for 5 months has freaking screwed everyone over. And C, that this is fairly existentially important for Europe, right? So Macron called on Europe to prepare for an attack by Russia in the coming years. He said that Putin's regime would not be able to win the war in Ukraine and called on his allies to show more activity in supporting Kyiv. So you could argue that Macron should have shown more activity before and that France should have helped more. But now France is saying, and I presume behind that there will be help and money and equipment going as well. France is the second biggest arms exporter in the world. They're in a great position to help. They really are. And so this is great rhetoric, and I assume action, because he wouldn't be calling and convening an emergency meeting if he wasn't doing stuff as well. Zelensky made a speech last night. Today, I took part in a special summit in Paris, I presume by virtual link, a summit of leaders convened by Mr. President of France. The main topic is everything that strengthens us in Europe, our resilience, our capabilities, of course, our arsenals, our ability to produce weapons, the supply of weapons to Ukraine, and a continuity of support. Everything that we do together to defend against Russian aggression adds to the real security of our nations for decades to come, because each of Russia's losses and each of Russia's defeats teaches Russia and any other enemy of Europe that the free world as a whole, that aggression does not and cannot produce results. Cooperation and determination are the two answers that everyone should give in the question of ending the war and bringing peace closer. I thank everyone who works for Ukraine in this way. Thank you to everyone who is fighting for Ukraine. Glory to Ukraine. So I think, again, he's recognising the wide scope of the meeting last night and how important it is, and therefore how important European leaders realise it is across the board, right? So, some more on this. French President Macron announced a coalition of medium long-range missiles and bombs provision for Ukraine. Okay. He also said, now, this is what's causing equally a lot of chatter. He said that putting Western troops on the ground in Ukraine should not be excluded in the future. There's no consensus on that matter today. He's put it on the table. No, he said it shouldn't be taken off the table. Now, this has caused a lot of people to go, oh no, we're not sending troops, we're not sending troops. But the clever thing is, this is a bit like what the Russians do, is if you put something in the information space, you are, first of all, shifting the Overton window. So the Overton window is the range of what's okay to discuss. And if you throw things out there, and sometimes these are bonkers things. So what the Russians do is they throw loads of bonkers things out, often quite disparate things. They see what the reaction is, and then they just start allowing people to talk about it, even if it's crazy bonkers. Now here, you can argue that's crazy bonkers, or you can argue that that's not, and that's a sensible thing to talk about. But by putting it out there, now people are getting used to talking about it, that if this is then continually talked about for a few months, then if it does come to pushing those troops on into Ukraine, or if it comes to some big decision, people have been used to talking about it. It's not a big surprise. We've normalized the discussion, and then we can hopefully treat it not as an emotional response, but as a rational discussion and decision. And so this, I think, is incredibly astute. I don't know whether he is thinking in this meta way, but this, in my opinion, is incredibly astute of Macron to have done this. Even if people attack him as saying, don't be so crazy, that's World War III talk or whatever, that we're not going to invoke Article 5 or whatever it may be that he's criticised with that, he has mentioned it, and that will, I just think that's really important. Quote, the defeat of Russia is essential for security and stability in Europe. We will do everything necessary to ensure that Russia cannot win this war, he declared at the press conference. Next thing to say is that Ukraine do win this war. So those are two different things, arguably. But this is ramping up the rhetoric to reflect a ramping up of the importance of this conflict in the minds of the big leaders of the world. NATO Security Secretary General has come out just now to say that the alliance has no plans to send troops to Ukraine. Of course, he's going to say that. NATO allies are providing unprecedented support to Ukraine. We've been doing this since 2014 and stepped up our support since the full-scale invasion. But there are no plans for NATO combat troops on the ground in Ukraine. That's trivially true. They haven't planned it. Like, we are going to do it, so let's plan it now so that we can do that in 4.5 months' time. They haven't, of course. So you can come out and say that. It's water off a duck's back. We've not planned that. Although I would argue there probably are people in dark rooms doing contingency plans. But again, Macron has stated it. Poland, Czech Republic, and Sweden are not going to send their troops to Ukraine. The Prime Minister of Czechia stated there is no question of sending Czech military personnel to Ukraine. The same statements were made by Poland's Deputy Minister of National Defence and Sweden's Prime Minister. The latter added that the issue is not relevant and Ukraine does not need this, which you can argue is true, and they don't need it now, and Ukraine is saying we're going to do this ourselves. But again, it's out there. The cat is out the bag, and people can start stroking it. So, right. Now, as I mentioned, the big thing, the important move by France, allowing the EU to use their billions of euros to purchase ammo for Ukraine on global markets, and that's a recognition of challenges Kyiv is facing and welcome pragmatism and flexibility from the Elysee. It's massively significant news, and that will expedite artillery ammunition getting to Ukraine. Hopefully, that will include Turkey as well there. And he said, French president said, sending troops to Ukraine in the future cannot be ruled out and that nothing should be excluded. As mentioned, do whatever it takes. Right. Okay. The other thing to add to this, and I don't know if this didn't come from last night's discussion, but I'm tagging it on here, is because it also shows how important Macron is seeing this, and also an opportunity, you could argue, economically for France. So yes, we are talking about fighter planes with France. Zelensky said in the Ukraine Year 2024 forum yesterday, so this is another forum, it seems to confirm reporting from this year that the Ukrainian government has requested some of France's surplus Mirage 2000 fighters. That is being discussed. We also have Sweden now being ratified into NATO, and the possibility of Gripens finding their way to the front line as well. So things are looking good or better going forward, that you're having F-16s, Mirages and Gripens on the table. Right, Polish President Andrzej Duda has said that the idea of sending troops to Ukraine caused heated discussions at the meeting in Paris. Quote, the most heated discussion revolved around the issue of sending troops to Ukraine. And here too, there was absolutely no agreement. Now, it's about reading between the lines here. What he doesn't say is everyone disagreed that we should, about this, and what a ridiculous thing that Macron suggested. He said there was just no agreement, which means, to me, that means that there were probably a number of countries who were like, yeah, might have to come to that. We need to plan for that. Not necessarily saying we're going to do that. We need things in place to make sure that if that decision comes about, we are ready for that decision. Either way. Duda said after the meeting, adding that there was no enthusiasm for the idea either. So Poland has said, no, there's no enthusiasm. But I think there must have been some enthusiasm for there to be no agreement about it. That's me reading between the lines. Right. The current behind-the-scenes discussions are not about Europeans sending troops to fight the Russians. And this is such an important distinction as well. So we weren't party to the discussions, right, at this meeting that Macron convened. But it might well be that Macron is saying we're not sending frontline troops to, we're not sending troops to the front line, but sending troops to support the use of Mirage, sending maintenance crews to support Mirages, sending maintenance crews to support the F-16 or Taurus missile usage, etc., etc. So Rim Momtaz here says the current behind-the-scenes discussions are not about Europeans sending troops to fight the Russians. There are effective and needed tasks these troops could do in Ukraine, training, without being on a front line in direct battles with Russian troops. Training, building logistics up. He says there's an important difference here, and I think that is really significant. Now, I know I've talked about this, but it's about lifting the taboo, and this is what's discussed here. Last night, Emmanuel Macron lifted the greatest of all taboos on discussion of Western efforts to prevent the Russian victory in Ukraine. Are NATO members ready to send their own forces to fight the Russian invaders? Not yet, Macron said, but the possibility should no longer be excluded. Macron said boots on the ground question had been raised at an emergency summit at the Western arms supplies on Western arms supplies at the Elysee yesterday. No consensus exists at present, he said, but nothing should be excluded going forward. We will do all that it takes to ensure Russia can't win this war. Senior French sources said Macron's comments had been intended to reassure Ukraine and to prepare European opinion for a third and I haven't read this thread yet, by the way, but this is exactly what I was just saying. For a third and troubled year of the second Russian invasion. It's about normalizing the discussion, and so people's opinions this is getting them used to that discussion. But most of all, they had been intended as words of warning to Putin. So again, this is a shot across the bows. Short term, the conference made two important decisions to address Ukraine's shortage of weapons and especially artillery shells. France lifted its objection for using EU cash to buy scarce shells on the world market. It will lead to a coalition to provide Kyiv with medium and long range missiles. Priority will be given to 5 other areas: cyber defense, joint production of weapons and ammo in Ukraine, defense of Moldova, greater protection on the Ukraine-Belarusian border, and mine clearance. Macron admitted that the West has been imprudent in promising last year 1 million shells for Ukraine, which did not even exist in Western armories. The Czech idea to use European cash to buy the weapons elsewhere would now be implemented within 10 days. Is Macron's talk of sending Western troops another example of tough-sounding statement which cannot be implemented? The president's words were attacked today as crazy and an invitation to World War III by French opposition leaders. Pressed on the subject of a news conference last night, Macron said Western capitals should have the humility to recognise that their responses had often been 6 months to a year too late. The aim of the summit was to consider all possibilities for the future. I totally agree with Macron. and I would not criticize him in talking about this. Sending troops was raised among other options, he said. I absolutely did not say that France was favourable, nor did he oppose the idea, he said. There is a strategic ambiguity there, which I assume. Absolutely. Right. I'm going to dip into 3 discussions in a video that someone sent me, but it was actually on my watch list. I just hadn't got round to watching it yet, but my goodness, thanks to Kathy for making me watch this, because this is so worthy of seeing the whole of it. You have a meeting here that let's get everyone on the screen if I can. You've got the editor of The Economist there. She's Zeni Beddoes. She is comparing it. You've got Petr Pavel he's a Czech president. You've got Kaja Kallas again, showing herself there as Estonian leader. You've got who else? I'm just trying to get a picture. You've got De Croo, the Belgian Prime Minister. You've got Hillary Clinton, former Secretary of State and ran for president. You've got Mette Frederiksen, the Danish Prime Minister. You've got the Bulgarian Prime Minister there. And then in the audience, you've got Andrew Yermak, you've got Neil Ferguson, the historian, you've got Timothy Snider, the historian, you've got General Petraeus, all of these people giving their opinions. This was a really significant conversation, but it also spoke to me of the massive importance that Ukraine now has in international politics, that we are inching towards this confronting how serious this war is in terms of how it affects all of us, and also inching towards a potential World War III and trying to mitigate against that. But the way you do that is by giving Ukraine bleeding everything, and this is kind of what they're talking about. So this happened. This wasn't yesterday. This happened was it 4 days ago? Day after Navalny died. Here's Timothy Snider. We're going to start with Timothy Snider.
That Ukraine is in.
I'll try. The first thing I want to say is that we have to do our part to connect to the people on the ground. This is a very strange war in which the people of only one country are doing the fighting. This is a war with international implications, not just for Europe and North America, but for Asia. It's in many ways a world war, but it's a world war in which only one country is doing the resisting. In a strange way, because they've resisted so well, they're alone.
This is such a good point. So they are being a victim of their own success. Because they did so well initially, we weren't as concerned as we should have been. And we didn't give literally everything we should have done, that now we realise we should have given at that time. And it's now we've waited 2 years and go, oh yeah, no, things are a lot tougher. And now we need to give you loads of stuff, but we haven't really prepared ourselves to do that. And that's kind of what he's talking to.
They've lasted so long, and therefore they're alone. When you ask for a historical comparison, I think of 1938 or 1939. Poland held off the Wehrmacht for a while, longer than people remember, at great losses, but it was a matter of weeks, not years, and so others had to come in. Because the Ukrainians have resisted so well, no one else has had to fight yet. And so I don't think we appreciate how much they are doing for us, and that therefore our duty has to be to bring the things to them that they need. It's shocking, given our economic preponderance, and this is my second point, how slowly we have mobilized that. It's a mistake of the 21st century to think that economic preponderance automatically leads to some kind of victory. You have to find creatively the ways to move that economical preponderance onto the battlefield. And we have not been creative enough about that, and we have not been quick enough about that. If we compare what we have done, with all due respect to the leaders of my own country and European friends, if we compare it to all the improvisations, all of the workarounds that Roosevelt found or Churchill found, we're not up to that standard. And that's the standard that we have to hold ourselves up to. The next point that I want to make, which I think is very important, is this idea of duch svobody, the spirit of freedom, that this is all one struggle. When Secretary Clinton speaks of cyber war, this is
And so we're going to go back to what Clinton mentioned, because it is so on point. And he's talking about this isn't just a war in a battle spaces, it's a war, a cyber war and an information war. And this is all one war and we're all part of it.
This is an example of how what the Ukrainians are doing is part of one struggle, which affects all of us. They're just doing 10,000 times more than everyone else, but it's nevertheless one struggle. We can't do without the category of victory, right? Last thing. Secretary Clinton used the word victory. Mr. Yermak talked about winning. You don't always win wars, but you never win them unless you set victory as the goal. We have to set victory as the goal. In 2024, the Europeans have to help the Ukrainians hold the line, with or without the Americans. I'm optimistic about March, I'm optimistic about November, but with or without the Americans, the word that we all have to use is victory. If we don't set that as the goal, it's not clear what we have to do in the meantime. Thank you.
Absolutely nailed it there. And we're going to go next to Anne Applebaum. Now, she is author, journalist, reporter. Her book, Twilight of Democracy, is a must-read, in my opinion. She lives in Poland. I think she's married to a Polish man as an American. Her views on the war are excellent. She's well worth following on Twitter, for example. She's going to refer to what Clinton says again, but we're going to listen to her before going back to Clinton.
So much, and let me just first say that I wish I wasn't right. So thanks for that. Let me make 2 points. One is to echo what Neil just said and what others have said, that
that's the historian Neil Ferguson, who gave an excellent talk just after Timothy Snider. Well worth listening, but we don't have time.
It's incorrect right now to think of what we're doing now as fighting a Cold War. There isn't one bloc on one side and one bloc on the other side. What we are fighting is a connected group of autocracies who cooperate when it suits them, not always, who have not necessarily anything in common ideologically. So
such a good
nationalist point. Russia and communist China and Bolivarian Venezuela and Cuba and Iran, theocratic Iran, would not agree about many things. The one thing they agree about is that they don't like us. They don't like the people in this room. They don't.
Such a simplistic way of seeing it, but so on point. It's like they are like, they don't, it's a marriage of convenience. They don't really get on. Like the Soviet Union and the Islamic theocracy of Iran and, communist China, just, Russia, Russian Federation, don't really get on, other than the enemy of our enemy is our friend. So we're all friends because we all hate them.
They don't like liberal democracies. They don't like the rule of law that President Zelensky spoke about this morning. This is what they need to destroy. They need to destroy it firstly in their own countries. So you saw the death of Alexei Navalny is one of many, one of many crimes that the Russian president has committed to stay in power. And increasingly, they don't like it anywhere else because the existence of Navalny's people and Navalny's friends and Navalny's organizations and people who've been influenced by Navalny in other countries can be beamed back into Russia. So they now understand their concept of the world war is that they are fighting the same set of ideas at home and abroad. Sometimes it's an ideological conflict, as I just almost said President Clinton. Excuse me, the person who should have been President Clinton.
Ouch.
As Secretary Clinton has just said, sometimes they fight ideologically, sometimes they fight economically, sometimes they fight militarily. But it's the same kind of fight. So that's the first point. The second point is we need to be thinking in the same way. Look, this war is over when Russia leaves. And it doesn't really matter how Russia leaves or why they leave. They leave because they lose on the battlefield. They leave because their economy has crashed. They leave because We've shut down their electricity grid. I'm just making that up, but and we are not being sufficiently creative about thinking about fighting them in all the different ways that they fight us. So cyber, information, sanctions, in a way, sanctions, we've sanctioned lots of things, but we've pursued very few of those sanctions. We haven't tracked down the trucks that go across the Polish or Lithuanian border into Russia, supposedly going to Kazakhstan. We still aren't treating this war against Russia as if it were our war. If it were our war, it wouldn't be 6 guys at the Treasury in the United States who are running the sanctions policy. It would be a team of 1,000 people at the.
Huge point. Huge point. Like the amount of the mass of people, like if America were at war directly with Russia, you would have the Pentagon getting involved in sanctions and whatnot. But that's not what's happening yet. We're kind of it's this quasi war footing or quasi approach to like being serious about helping Ukraine.
Pentagon. In the United States who are running the sanctions policy, it would be a team of 1,000 people at the Pentagon. So that's the way we need to think, and that's how we can win. Thank you.
Thank you.
And so I thought that was absolutely spot on. Now we're going to go back to Clinton, and again, I don't really care what you think about her. It's about the content here as being absolutely on point.
States' interest for Europe. It's in do.
So sorry.
I guess I have 2 simple questions for you. One is, will this supplemental be passed and will the US show up? And 2, can we in Europe still rely on the US?
Well, first, let me say I think Europe should do what the prime ministers have said they intend to do, regardless of what happens from the US. I think it.
And you could argue that in some weird way, this impasse in Congress has actually prompted Europe to be in a better position than it otherwise would have been, by necessity. I think unfortunately, it's going to have cost more Ukrainian lives. So that's why I don't think it's a good thing on balance. It would have been nice if this could have happened and the US gave the $60 billion plus package. But, Clinton, for those of you who might not be fans of Clinton, you will like what she's saying there, which is, Europe still needs to step up big time.
It's in Europe's interest, it's in Ukraine's interest, and it is in the United States' interest for Europe to continue to increase its support, increase its defense spending, increase its cooperation in order to confront Russia and to be prepared for what happens in Ukraine and beyond. But I do think.
I don't want to be too, not puerile here, but I love it when I listen to like competent people speak, like people that know their onions. Like this is an excuse to have a go at Trump, but when I listen to Trump speak, it's so vacuous and so it's all about how wonderful he is. But he's not clever enough. He's literally not clever enough to deliver a speech like what she is saying. He's just not got the intelligence. And that sounds harsh, but it's absolutely true. Like if you think of his very best speeches he's ever given, like the ones that contain the most content are the ones that have been script written for him. So this is Hillary Clinton speaking off the cuff here and making more sense than he has ever made in his 4-year tenure as president.
That the United States will finally pass the supplemental. It will probably not happen until March. There is, as you know, a minority of Republicans in the House who have been holding it up. If it gets a vote in the House, it will pass overwhelmingly on a bipartisan vote.
Yep.
So the challenge will be getting it to the floor, and there are a number of ways that can happen, but the new Speaker of the House recessed the House until February 28th, so there will be no official business until that date and after. It is also, I think, clear that the administration remains committed. About half of the Republicans in the Senate remain committed.
Yep.
So one way or another, we will see additional funding. But I want to make a broader point, because I think what you've heard from the prime ministers today is very historically important, and I want to underscore that. Part of it is a recognition of the threat to Ukraine being a threat to Europe, a threat to the transatlantic alliance. But part of it is...
So what you've missed there is all these other politicians, these heads of state, saying this is serious now and we need to stand up and do something big time, right? Which is like what I was talking about, like inching towards World War III, is a kind of an acceptance of that, or an acceptance of we need to stop that, and in order to stop that from happening, we need to do a lot more now, and this is a war that involves all of us as Europeans.
It's also a recognition that there has to be a commitment by European nations and the EU to do more to defend themselves. And I would argue that if we look at Ukraine right now, we need to be looking at the battle space, the cyberspace, and the headspace.
Amen, sister. You know, this is what I have been saying, and like, not that I, you know, lots of people have been saying it, whatever. But this is one of my major points, is that we win the war on the battlefield so that we can win the war in the information spaces, which is your cyber into headspace. And that's exactly what she says. And so, do you know what? Good on you.
The battle space needs, as Prime Minister Frederiksen said, more speed and scale. So finding those munitions wherever they can be found, stopping shipping to others in order to ship to Ukraine, looking for new production capacities, working with Ukraine to increase domestic capacity. All of that has to be done, and there also has to be a recognition that whatever reasons there were initially to withhold longer range artillery and more air support is no longer in any way relevant to the battle space and to the future of this conflict and what it means for all of us.
Brilliant. It's like, there are no red lines. Just get on and give them some frickin' missiles.
So whatever hesitancy there was, I think reality should have overcome it. And we need to do much more quickly, and I certainly think that's true for the United States as well. And, you know, I see some people that I had the privilege of working with in the Obama administration, like former General Petraeus here, and I think part of our message has to be to our own government: get more creative, get much more in the pipeline more quickly, because part of it is the delay between passing legislation and appropriation and actually getting things out the door.
Honestly, like, that's why I say she's so on point. This is so on point.
Cyberspace, there's begun to be a recognition that this is also a battlefield, and we need to be much more creative. The Ukrainians have been extraordinarily ingenious, but there needs to be much more help given to them. And the cyberspace is not just a military space, it is an influence space. And we see an extraordinary effort by the Russians, a successful effort, I believe, to influence minds, to affect political decision-making, to make it difficult for leaders in Bulgaria and elsewhere to really convince populations, because they're getting so many other messages through social media and other sources about...
She totally understands this, right? So Bulgarian leader's just been talking about convincing his own public, and this. She can join these things together. She just, like, this is competence, and what she's saying is just so on point, and what all of these people said was so on point.
What Russia is really doing and meaning that runs counter to the warnings and the threats that we should be communicating. So that leaves the headspace. And I think it's absolutely important to be realistic and maybe to go from being too optimistic to less optimistic, but not to in any way cede that headspace where we have to do a much better job of convincing ourselves, convincing our countries, our governments, that we have to stand with Ukraine and make sure that they do win. And it's going to be critical that we do that in a series of ways, including not just government actions and rhetoric, but also being smarter about the influence side of this ongoing conflict. You know, I'll just...
And that's what Anne Applebaum was talking about, saying we aren't creative enough. How many times have I told you that we're not fighting back with our own troll farms? How many times have I told you that the Russian trolls have got free rein to do what they like, and we don't have an answer? We don't know what to do about that. Anne Applebaum, building on what Clinton was saying here, was saying we need to be creative about fighting back in different ways. And that one of those is in the headspaces, in the information space.
End by saying, you know, Russia has been a master of active measures for a very long time. Their propaganda was quite successful in recent years in a number of arenas, one of which I know very well.
She was all, you know, the DNC, the leaks, all that stuff against Hillary Clinton. She was on a receiving end of active measures to do with Russia. She knows about this from first hand, right? If you need to go, if you haven't watched it already, go and watch Active Measures on Amazon Prime. That's your homework. If you haven't seen it, it is a must watch.
And I think it's important that we recognize we can't just assume that that is an area that they are going to dominate without giving them a fight. And we are not even in the same arena. They are influencing Africa, Asia, Latin America. Their message about what this war is about, who the aggressor is, what the consequences are, is going unanswered. And it's mostly being waged on social media. Finally, I just saw a...
Man, if I was in the same room, I would have run up to her and given her a hug. Like, that is just like, or a high five. That is just awesome.
An analysis of what's on TikTok. And remember, TikTok is easily influenced by the Chinese government. So they may not be providing as much physical material, but they're certainly providing intellectual influence. If you look at and analyze content on TikTok, it is about a 50-to-1 ratio, pro-Russia versus anti-Ukraine.
She meant pro-Ukraine, so pro-Russia to pro-Ukraine.
What are we doing? Why are we not engaged in that battle space, that cyberspace, that headspace? So
yes.
I think European leaders have really stepped up. And I think eventually the American House of Representatives will as well. But, you know, we have a long struggle ahead of us. And the obvious point to make about Donald Trump is take him literally and seriously. He means what he says. People did not take him literally and seriously in 2016. Now he is telling us what he intends to do. And people who try to wish it away, brush it away, are living in an alternative reality.
I know I've got some big Trump supporters out there, but listen to what she says now. I thought this was interesting with regard to coming out of NATO.
He will do everything he can to become an absolute authoritarian leader if given the opportunity to do so. And he will pull us out of NATO, even though the Congress passed a resolution saying that he couldn't without congressional support, because he will just not fund our obligations. So we may be there, you know, in name only. So take it very serious.
That's interesting. So it's not necessarily about pulling out formally, but it's about not fulfilling NATO obligations. Just saying, yeah, well, you're on your own. We're not really doing it. What are you going to do about it?
And continue to do what Europe needs to do on its own.
So that is a...
I thought that was really good for a whole host of reasons, but just the whole that whole Munich Security Conference lunch here that was, and you know, with what General Petraeus had to say, with what all of those leaders had to say, was so worthy, but also reflective of how serious this thing now is. I'm going to leave this video. I was going to go on and do the military aid, and I was going to go and do the other geopolitical news, but I think this should stand alone probably as its own video, and I might refer back to it. Let me know what you think. I know some of you will vehemently disagree with me, you know, grandstanding Hillary Clinton, but I don't give a damn. I only care about whether what she says is on point or not. So if you're going to disagree with anything, please disagree with substance, not messenger. And that's the same with me. If you ever disagree with me, you know, call me out on the substance. I get so often like trolls in the threads just saying, "Oh, you're a liar," or this or that, and like these. And sometimes it's a paragraph full of just basically invective or assertion. No. If I'm all of those things, exactly what did I say that was an overt lie? Exactly what did I say? You know who you are. There's some people that consistently say the same sort of things, and they come at me with stuff and say, "Oh, you're just a liar for saying this." No. That's A, that's not what I said, and B, you need to show me where I actually lied. And it's the same with these people. You know, where are they wrong? Substance. Anyway, thanks for listening. Take care. Speak soon.